Howdy folks, and welcome to The Ghost of Tsushima. Developed by Sucker Punch and published by Sony, it is of course a PlayStation exclusive, but don't let that put you off. This is an excellent game. As the name would suggest, the game is set on the Japanese island of Tsushima, in the year 1274, the year of the first Mongol invasion of Japan. Well, I say the Japanese island of Tsushima. As late as 1950, Korea was claiming the island, which sits halfway between Korea and, well, I hesitate to use the word mainland Japan, because Japan is an archipelago of islands, but you get the idea. But the game does attempt to stick as close as possible to the actual historical events, including this, the Battle of Komoda Bay, where a force of 80 samurai attempted to defend Tsushima against an invading force of anything between 6,000 to 8,000 Mongol warriors. Spoiler, it didn't end well for the samurai, although they did manage to hold the defences on the beach successfully until nightfall, when their final cavalry charge was defeated and their positions were overrun. The game's been picking up a lot of praise from Japanese sources for its accurate portrayal of not only Japanese feudal history but also Japanese feudal culture and samurai traditions in particular, one of which you can see happening here. Lord Adachi, the samurai champion, is being sent down to challenge the Mongol champion to single combat. This was something that the samurai would do before battles, in the hope that the loss of their champion would demoralise the enemy army and they'd leave without a fight. And sometimes it actually happened. But the Mongols have a different way of doing things.
Outsiders! Send your finest warrior to face me! Nada, Jinnida. I am Harunobu Adachi, descendant of the legendary Yoshinobu Adachi. Samurai! Do you surrender?
Cowards without honor deserve no mercy. No mercy! Open fire! For Tsushima!
No records exist as to whether or not anything precisely like that actually happened during the defence of Tsushima, although if anything like this had happened, it wouldn't have been completely out of the question. Later that same month, when the Mongol horde had finished with Tsushima itself and had moved on to the Japanese main island of Kyushu at the Battle of Hakata Bay, it was recorded that when the grandson of the Japanese commander fired an arrow to announce the beginning of the battle, the Mongols all just burst out laughing. In fact, the Mongols made a habit of fighting in a way that the samurai were just not used to. They would advance, shoulder to shoulder, protected by their shields with their polearms, forming a dense wall of spikes in front of them, throwing paper and iron bombs, which made life extremely difficult for the samurai cavalry. Those few samurai who were actually able to control their horses and prevent them from panicking with the noise of all the bombs going off around them found it next to impossible to break through the Mongol shield wall. Well, I say the Mongol shield wall, and that's not technically incorrect because the invading armies were part of the Mongol Empire, under Kublai Khan, the fifth Khan of the Mongol Empire, and the founder of the Chinese Yuan dynasty, where he ruled as the first Yuan emperor until his death in the year 1294. And a fair number of the commanders and most of the troops in the Mongol invasion force of Tsushima in the year 1274 were actually from Korea, which itself was part of the Mongol Empire. Having finally been conquered by the Mongols and turned into a vassal state of the Yuan dynasty only 3 years before the Mongols turned their attention to Japan after a campaign that had lasted 39 years. But now that we're all caught up with recent ancient history, does that make sense? I mean, you know what I mean. This is the point where the game takes a little sidestep from recorded historical accuracy. You play the game as Jin Sakai, the last surviving member of Clan Sakai and the only samurai to survive the slaughter of the defense of Komoda Bay. Which of course never happened in reality. The samurai at Komoda Bay all fought and died to the last man, but well, we have to have one survivor, otherwise there wouldn't be a game. Left for dead on the beach, you are dragged to relative safety by a peasant thief who goes by the name of Yuna, patched up, not exactly nursed back to full health, and it's here where your adventure begins. Initially, you have no armour, no weapons. The Mongols are busy burning and killing everything that they can see, and your initial task is to simply escape the destruction with the peasant thief Yuna who rescued you from the beach. But of course, you're a samurai. Skulking around in the shadows, running and hiding just isn't your bag, baby. So once you're no longer at risk of instant death, what's the first thing you do? Charge the castle, challenge the Khan to single combat in an attempt to rescue your uncle who's been taken prisoner, and immediately get your arse handed to you. And that is pretty much where the actual game begins. So now what are you going to do? Well, if your guess is ride around the island, taking out Mongol outposts, composing haiku poetry, taking baths in hot springs, chasing foxes around shrines, picking up collectibles, and yes, climbing radio towers, then congratulations. You're smarter than you look, because this is in fact Far Cry 6, Red Dead Samurai Redemption. Now if you're a particular fan of that Ubisoft style of open world exploration gameplay, this isn't necessarily going to be a bad thing. And I am quite a fan of that Ubisoft style of open world exploration gameplay. Nevertheless, it's getting kind of old. This sort of thing has been done before. Far Cry 3, Far Cry 4, Far Cry 5, Just Cause, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. It's getting kind of old. So what does Ghost of Tsushima do that's sufficiently fresh and different to dispel the feeling that all you're really doing is playing Ghost Creed 6, Assassin's Odyssey, Red Dead Samurai Wildlands? Well, first of all, and I realise that this is incredibly superficial, but holy shit, this is a pretty game. I've honestly lost track of the number of times I've been forced to just stop and look around and take in the scenery. Sucker Punch have done an astonishing job on the aesthetics. They've also gone out of their way to try to make the UI as unobtrusive as possible, with the bare minimum of necessary information on screen at any one time, which really goes a long way to helping you enjoy just how amazingly good looking this game is. Even something as simple as the "Where am I going now" indicator from the location that you've pinned on your map is represented in-game by the actual environment rather than being a UI element at the top of or in the middle of your screen. All these gusts of wind and various different leaves and cherry blossoms scattered on the breeze, they're actually pointing the way to my next destination. Also, pay attention to the golden bird fluttering through the air ahead of me. That's the game's extremely subtle and extremely pretty way of telling me, follow this bird and it will lead you to an undiscovered section of the map. Someplace that might be useful, someplace that you might not have noticed if you hadn't been paying attention to the wildlife. Places like, for example, this camp of survivors, which I wouldn't have known was there if I hadn't been following the golden bird. I really appreciate subtle little touches like this, that don't drag you out of the experience in the way that a dirty great big red arrow honking in the direction of whatever it was that the game wanted you to look at might. I also like the way the game deals with the touchy subject of the stealth kill, which you might not think would be a touchy subject if you're used to playing, well, every other game of this type, but Jin's a samurai. They have a certain code that they're supposed to follow, and sneaking up behind people and slitting their throats isn't exactly the sort of thing that samurai do. When they kill somebody, they're supposed to face them and look them in the eye while they're doing it. And that's going to be a bit of a problem for young Jin here, because, well, it's just not practical to walk up to every Mongol on the island of Tsushima and challenge them to single combat. Even if it worked, and there's no guarantee that it would, because the Mongols were not known for playing by samurai rules, it would take a really long time. And so Yuna, the peasant thief who rescued you from the slaughter on the beach at Komoda Bay, and whose blacksmith brother we're attempting to rescue here, is given the job of trying to impress upon you the absolute necessity of not always playing by the samurai rulebook.
We can look for a gap in the front wall. Slip inside.
And cut down the Mongols where they stand.
If something goes wrong, they'll kill the prisoners. I've seen them do it. We have to go in quietly.
Like thieves.
What's wrong with that?
Before the samurai, this island was ruled by criminals. We changed that by creating order and delivering justice in the open. We live by a code of honor. And sometimes we die by it. Warriors like my father, we just wanted to give us a safer home.
I want the same thing. But we have to fight back.
I promised my uncle I'd never break our code.
Then bend it. To save my family. And what's left of yours.
Let's get a closer look. See what we're up against.
We should wait until it gets darker.
Okay, so this is the part of the game, and it is still quite early on, where we're introduced to the stealth elements. And here at least, making a stealth kill is non-negotiable. But this is what I really like about Ghost of Tsushima, compared to other games of this ilk, games like Ghost Recon Wildlands, Far Cry 5, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where mastering the stealth aspects of the game is actually pretty essential. I mean, if you're playing on higher difficulty settings in one of those games and you try to just brute force your way through the various different encounters, you'll end up, in most cases, pretty much just getting overwhelmed and killed. Now, in some games like this, I do really enjoy the stealth and assassination kills. Assassin's Creed Odyssey in particular did an excellent job of it, and I, in that game at least, definitely had a lot of fun specialising in assassination. But Jin's not a ninja, he's a samurai. And if you're like me, and you're really getting into the whole cultural aspect of the game, the idea of sneaking up behind somebody and sticking a knife in their back doesn't really sit well with me. Luckily, while this very first assassination kill in the game is non-negotiable, in order to teach you how to do it, the game does make it pretty clear that while this is going to be an option in the future, Jin is far from happy with it. And luckily, because he is a samurai, Jin has other options. Options that are at least as effective as these kind of stealth kills, and in fact you might even argue, more effective. And in fact, given how much I enjoyed the stealth elements of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I found myself being quite pleasantly surprised at just how much I absolutely loved the polar opposite of the stealth kill here in Ghost of Tsushima. This is an option that's also available to Jin, and it's called the Standoff. So if you don't want to be a sneaky backstabbing thief type, which you absolutely can do, the option is always there, you can instead basically walk up to the nearest group of Mongols and yell at them words to the effect of, "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough." You hold down the relevant controller button and release it at the precise moment that the enemy strikes. Get it right, it's an instant kill. Get it wrong, and you lose almost all of your health. Far more than you would have taken from a normal melee strike. So there is a substantial element of skill involved, and it's going to take some practice to get it right, but it's an ability that you can chain on multiple enemies and take them all out in one-shot kills right at the start of a fight, drastically reducing the number of opponents that you have to deal with. And I absolutely love it. In fact, I love this mechanic so much that I rarely bother with stealth unless it's absolutely necessary and the mission requirements specifically call for it. With a little practice, obviously, you get better at it. Here I am, substantially later on in the game, although still in the first act. Following the golden bird, when I come across a bunch of Mongols,
Someone's being tortured.
harassing some peasants. Now I could sneak in, there's plenty of long grass here, which would allow me to do that, but I'm a samurai, I ain't got time for that.
Who will face me first?
The enemies get a bit trickier as well. Watch this guy attempt to fake me out into committing early. There it is, did you see it? I'm not falling for that old gag. One down. Comes the next one. 2 down. And 3 down. Standoff streak completed. Who wants some of this? I love that the game gives you this kind of option. I mean, not just because it's more like what a samurai would do, but I appreciate that some people are going to enjoy the stealth elements and the assassination kills. And if that's what floats your boat, you can absolutely play that way, specialise your character in playing that way, and have a lot of fun doing it. But it also gives you the option of being a samurai badass, in a way that would just get you outright slaughtered if you try to do it in any other game. I mean, imagine walking into a drug cartel stronghold in Ghost Recon Wildlands, or a Spartan fort in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and just brazenly standing in the gateway, drawing a line in the sand with your foot, and inviting anybody who thinks that they're hard enough to come and have a go. You'd be gunned down within seconds. You just don't have the option of taking this kind of approach in most other of these open world style games, and I absolutely love that you do in Ghost of Tsushima. Now you might be thinking that the combat is looking kind of basic, but it's actually, well, it's certainly not complicated, but it's not as straightforward as it might first appear. Basically, you have 2 attack buttons on your controller, and one of them is just a straight sword slash, but the other one executes a different type of attack depending on the fighting stance that you currently have selected. There are 4 of these fighting stances in total. You only have access to 1 at the beginning. Stone stance, which is particularly effective against swordsmen, but it's kind of crap against opponents armed with shields, polearms, or big heavy 2-handed weapons. Now, if you haven't unlocked the other stances that are effective against other weapon combinations, you're still not completely at a loss if you come up against, for example, somebody armed with a sword and shield, and you're using the stone stance. You can, which I just did there, use a thrown weapon, like a throwing knife, to stagger him and create an opening so you can get in there and kill him, even if you're not technically using the correct stance for it. Unfortunately, you have a very limited supply of throwing weapons, and if you end up running out, you can still get around somebody who's armed with a weapon that you're either in the wrong stance for, or you haven't unlocked the stance for that weapon-equipped opponent yet, by making use of the dodge key to avoid their attack, blindside them, and get a strike in where they're vulnerable. It's always better, however, to use the correct stance for the opponent that you're facing. You can see how almost completely ineffective this stone stance is against an opponent armed with a shield. So I'm going to back off, I'm going to swap stances. There we go, water stance, specifically designed to bash shields out of the way so that you can skewer the guy holding it. It's a very satisfying and effective combat system. And you know it must be simple if somebody as legendarily cack-handed as me has managed to get to grips with it. But it's not all running around sticking sharp metal objects into poor defenceless Mongols who never did anybody any harm. As you'd expect in a game of this type, there's all kinds of other things to do and see. Now I realise that this is something of a bone of contention with significant proportion of the player base, because a lot of the time, and yes, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I'm looking at you here, this running around collecting various items and climbing various things and finding various things is nothing more than busy work. It's there partially to satisfy the completionists, but mostly just to pan out the game with a lot of, well, content that's basically just there to keep you busy. And Ghost of Tsushima is definitely not innocent of this sort of thing, but I do appreciate that at least Sucker Punch went to the trouble to try to make that sort of content at least as Japanese and jaw-droppingly pretty as everything else in the game. For example, there are various locations, usually extremely pretty and scenic, where you will be invited to stop for a moment and compose a haiku poem. Yes, really, I am not making this up.
never-ending flow. Unafraid, defenders stand. Ready for the end.
And taking the time to sit and compose that haiku has rewarded me with the Headband of Death. It's a cosmetic item, it has no in-game benefit, but it's just so samurai. Also, while you're out and about in the world, it pays to keep both your eyes and your ears open for the sight and sound of any foxes wandering the woods. Find a fox, and it will lead you to an Inari shrine, where if you pay your respects, you'll earn some progress towards unlocking various charms which can be applied to your weapons, granting various different beneficial effects in combat. Also, keep your eyes open for plumes of steam on the horizon. These often indicate the presence of hot springs where you can have a nice relaxing bath, exposing some hot Japanese man-ass to all and sundry, while reflecting on the nature of things and also earning yourself a slight increase to the size of your health pool. And I'm not joking about the reflecting on the nature of things part. You do actually have to pick a subject to think about while you're enjoying your bath.
When Uncle is free, we'll eat his favorite meal. Vegetables sweetened with mirin on a bed of rice.
Unfortunately, I was only partially joking earlier when I said that you have to climb radio towers. If there was one thing from Far Cry 4 that they could have chosen not to copy, this is it. The infamous radio towers in Far Cry 4, which they made a joke about in Far Cry 5, were an infamous pain in the arse. Because they were not just boringly repetitive, but also kind of necessary because they revealed the map around you. So, unless you just wanted to wander around lost, you kind of had to do the radio towers. You don't have to do these mountaintop shrines in Ghost of Tsushima, although you're probably going to want to do them anyway because the reward for successfully negotiating one of them is a charm which you can use to enhance your combat abilities. So they are only really technically optional. You're probably going to end up doing them anyway. On the bright side, unlike Far Cry 4's radio towers, like the rest of the game, they are astonishingly pretty. My only other real criticism of Ghost of Tsushima would be the story. It doesn't really have one, beyond kick the Mongols off the island and win the game. It's not like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where I really wanted to know what happened to Cassandra, or Red Dead Redemption 2, where I was heavily invested in following the story of Arthur Morgan. It's not that the game is completely story-free. There are various different characters which you're going to want to recruit in order to aid you in throwing the Mongols off the island, and each of these characters does have their own storyline which you can follow. It's just that once you're done with them, you're done with them. Beyond kicking the Mongols off the island, there is no overarching story to lead you through the game. At least not so far, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through the first act, and I've so far liberated around about 1/4 of the island of Tsushima, so if there is some kind of epic storyline waiting to unfold, it's taken its time getting there. And this, for me at least, because I do like a good story, is a fairly major criticism of the game. But it's one that I'm prepared to put up with, because everything else about it is just so incredibly good. This is the game that's been occupying most of my free time for the best part of the last week. I'm having a great time playing it, and the only thing I'm not really looking forward to is getting to the end and completing it. Still, I hope all of you glorious card-carrying members of the PC gaming master race have enjoyed this little sneak peek into what those console peasants have been getting up to for the last week, because that is it for today. I hope you've enjoyed it, I hope you're all having a great weekend, and as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.
Let's see.
Butchers!
The tail is through! The samurai spirit! Buddha, protect me!
The forest is safe. That should give the man by the road a new tale to tell.